Let's talk about the math behind an election. No, really. Not just who gets the most votes, but how those votes actually turn into seats in government. We're diving into a huge legal battle that went all the way to the Philippine Supreme Court, all over a single formula. A formula that decides who gets to represent you in Congress.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll tackle the party list puzzle itself. Then, we'll look at the big challenge to its fairness. After that, we'll get into the Supreme Court's answer, and finally, we'll talk about why this whole thing actually matters to you.
Okay, let's get into it. The whole idea of the party list system is to give a voice to groups that might not otherwise get heard. But, figuring out who actually gets a seat, that's where it gets complicated.
And that brings us to the one question at the very heart of this entire case. It kind of makes you rethink how voting works, right? When you cast your vote, does it have the exact same power as the vote cast by the person next to you? Well, as we're about to find out, the answer isn't as simple as you'd think.
So, just to make sure we're all on the same page, a quick refresher. Your district representative, they're elected by people in a specific town or city. Party list reps, on the other hand, are elected by the whole country. The goal is what's called proportional representation. The more votes a party gets nationwide, the more seats it should have. At least, that's the idea.
Now, the rulebook for all this isn't just in some law. The actual math comes from a major Supreme Court decision called BANAT versus COMELEC. You can think of this BANAT formula as the reigning champion. It's the system that was put on trial here.
And here's exactly how that formula works. It's a two-round system. In round one, if your party gets at least 2% of the total vote, boom, you're guaranteed one seat. Pretty straightforward. But round two is where it gets spicy. The leftover seats are handed out to all parties, including the ones that already won, based on their original total number of votes. Remember that part? It's the whole reason we're here.
So along come the challengers. Two party list groups, ANGKLA, representing Filipino seafarers, and the Serbisya Sabayan Party, or SBP. They looked at that two-round system and said, wait a minute, something about this math just isn't fair. Their whole argument pretty much boiled down to this one phrase: double counting. They said that when you use a party's full vote count again in round two, you're effectively counting some votes twice. And what does that do? Well, they argued it dilutes the weight of votes for the smaller parties, the ones who didn't get that guaranteed seat in round one.
This table makes it super clear what they wanted to change. Look, round one is exactly the same. No one's arguing with that. But check out round two in their proposal. Before you hand out more seats, you first have to deduct a value equal to 2% from the big winners. It's one little change, but it would have completely shaken up the results.
Okay, so the challenge was made, the argument was laid out, so how did the Supreme Court hit back? Let's walk through their defense of the old formula, point by point.
First up, they took on that one-person, one-vote idea. The court basically said, look, that's a great principle, but you can't apply it so rigidly here. The Constitution actually gives Congress a lot of freedom, wide discretion, to design this system. They pointed out that we already have things that aren't perfectly proportional, like the 3-seat cap for any single party, and nobody says that's unconstitutional.
Second, the court looked at the history of the law itself. They said the original law was actually meant for the high-performing parties to use their full vote count to get more seats. The BANAT ruling didn't change that core idea. It just opened the door for more parties to compete in the second round to make sure all the available seats were filled.
So what about that double counting claim? This is where it gets a little technical, but it's super important. The court said, nope, there's no double counting. Why? Because you only count the votes one time. The two rounds aren't two different counts. They're two different stages of allocating seats that just happen to use the same single tally.
And then came the final argument, and this one was the knockout punch. The court said that if they adopted the petitioner's new formula, they'd be doing something called judicial legislation. Basically, they'd be rewriting the law, and that's Congress's job, not theirs. And to top it off, they said the new formula would create a truly absurd result.
So what is this absurd result? Let's just imagine for a second. There's a party. We'll call them Party X. They campaign hard, and they get exactly 2% of the vote. Great. Under the current rules, they get their one guaranteed seat in round one.
But now, let's try it the petitioner's way. Before we move to round two, we have to apply their deduction. So, we take Party X's hard-earned 2% of the vote, and we subtract 2%.
And what's left? Zero. Nothing. Zilch. Their vote share for getting any more seats drops to zero. They get punished for doing well in the first round. The court looked at that and said, Yeah, that makes no sense at all.
And this quote from the decision really just says it all. The court's message was clear. You might have your own idea of what's fair, and that's fine. But our job isn't to create what we think is fair. Our job is to apply the law that Congress actually wrote.
So, after all that complex math and legal wrangling, what was the final call? And more importantly, what's the big takeaway from all this?
Well, the outcome was crystal clear. The petition from ANGKLA and SBP was denied. The Supreme Court gave the BANAT formula its stamp of approval, saying it's perfectly constitutional. The system stays as is.
So here's what this all boils down to. First, this was a massive display of judicial restraint. The court refused to act like a legislature. Second, it confirmed that figuring out what's proportional is a job for politicians in Congress, not for judges. And finally, it's a huge reminder that these little technical rules of an election, they're not little at all. They have a massive impact on who actually gets to hold power.
But here's a wild little twist that came out in the court records. Turns out, the very groups who brought this case, ANGKLA and SBP, had actually won seats using this exact formula in the past. And one of them had even argued in defense of the BANAT formula in a previous case. It just goes to show you how in politics your view on the rules can sometimes depend on whether you're winning or losing the game.
But the story doesn't totally end there. The Supreme Court did one last, very interesting thing. While they upheld the law, they also made sure to send a copy of their decision over to Congress. The official reason? For a possible review. It's kind of like the court saying, look, it's legal, but you guys might want to take another look at this.
And that leaves us with the final big question. The legal battle is done, the formula is safe, but the Supreme Court has basically tossed the ball to Congress. So just because a law is constitutional, does that mean it's the best it can be? The court has made its decision, but the debate over the math of our democracy, that's definitely not over.